Limitation is the crucible of creativity. Do not pity the filmmaker who has a low budget. Rather, pity the one who has a limitless budget. Nothing is more terrifying for an artist than a completely blank sheet of paper. What do you do when you can do practically anything? Unless you cultivate self discipline to realize an intense creative vision, in other words, you supply your own limitation, you can end up with a vapid, overlong, self indulgent mess, swallowing up whatever your work was supposed to be in the sheer act of what you can do simply because you can do it. The low budget filmmaker is not so burdened. There is only so much you can do, and usually that is on the fly. Some filmmakers rail against their limitations and go for gusto, making sure that the audience nevertheless gets a full body shot of their paper mache monster in all of its glory. But others work with their limitations, allowing their limitations to coax out true genius. Not the genius of doing whatever they want with limitless resources. Anyone can do that. Rather, these geniuses work with what they do have to produce something that transcends its limitations. Low-budget horror has been associated with relentless gore for decades. If you can't wow them with your budget, then you can at least gross them out with your effects. Blood runs cheap, and so does buckets of offal from the local slaughterhouse. But atmosphere has always been more affecting. Gore can make you cringe and squeal and throw up and revel in the self-destruction of humanity, but it can never transcend itself. The worst it can threaten you with is a violent death. Atmosphere goes deeper than that. It reaches into your soul with fog-gray tendrils, suffocating your mind. Atmospheric horror does not rend apart your body. It rends apart your sense of reality and self. It was in this milieu that 1962's Carnival of Souls was produced. Reportedly, the idea was conceived when director Herc Harvey, while working on various industrial and educational films for Centron Films, drove past the closed and dilapidated remnants of the Salt Air Pavilion on Great Salt Lake, Utah. The monstrous abandoned hulk sat upon a dry salt plain, a shadow of its former glory, after finally closing in 1958. Built in 1926 to replace a previous bathing pavilion that had burned down in 1925, the Moorish revival wonderland had suffered through the Great Depression, a fire of its own, the receding waters of the lake, the lean years of World War II, and Americans' changing recreation habits afterwards. Nobody wanted to go all the way out to Salt Air to dance and play when there were equally good options along Salt Lake City's main street. Thus, it faded into dereliction, a ghost of past times, separate from the changing world around it. Harvey conceived a scene of ghouls dancing upon Salt Air's derelict dance floor, and passed the assignment on to Centron writer John Clifford. Drawing inspiration from Ambrose Bierce's 1890 short story, An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, and the 1961 French short film adaptation that became an episode of The Twilight Zone, the result was a magnificent study in trauma and alienation wrapped within an unsettling atmospheric horror. Unable to convince Centron to back the project, Harvey sought outside funding, to a total of $33,000, or just short of $350,000 in today's money. This forced Harvey into inventive solutions and guerrilla filmmaking. Unable to utilize expensive rear projection, he simply rigged a portable camera to a moving car, achieving far greater realism than any big-budget Hollywood movie simply by virtue of its being an actual car that was actually driving around. When the face of a ghoul haunting our protagonist appears in the window of the moving car, it was accomplished by one of the oldest practical effects in the magician's arsenal, the Pepper's Ghost. This is the effect by which glass becomes a mirror when the inside is lit more strongly than the outside, casting a ghost-like image on its reflective surface. When our protagonists go shopping, the scenes were made possible by a few quick bucks slipped to department store employees under the table. Most of the cast were just town locals, their stilted reading of lines adding to the overall disquieting atmosphere. Carnival of Souls' guerrilla realism offsets and highlights its disorienting effect. The story revolves around young Mary, played by the ethereally, almost extraterrestrially beautiful Candice Hilligoss. At the film's open, she is a passenger in a car drag racing across a bridge. Pushed into the fragile guardrail, the car careens off the bridge and into the murky waters below. Hours later, the only person to emerge is Mary. After this initial trauma, Mary packs up to a new job as a church organist in Utah. While driving out, she becomes haunted by a mysterious, ghoulish figure played by director Herc Harvey himself. Her attention is also drawn to the shadowy ruin of Saltaire, which looms over the horizon and over her consciousness, as if summoning her to she knows not what. Arriving at her destination, she is an alien in alien surroundings. Cold, aloof, distant. To her, the church is just a job, and the little old lady at the rooming house is just a landlord. About the only real human connection she makes is to the other resident of the rooming house, a lecherous scumbag named John, played by Sidney Berger. He is an uneducated creep, constantly propositioning Mary and unable to take no for an answer. Given to beginning his day with a nightcap, you know he's the kind of guy who would happily slip something into a woman's drink if the alcohol alone wasn't enough. He even parades his trajectory towards domestic abuse as the film progresses. In short, he is the opposite of everything Mary actually needs in terms of healthy human connection. He is Thanatos, self-destruction, in contrast with the pious but distant authorities of the town doctor and town minister. Thus he holds a strange appeal for her, but she doesn't exactly know what she wants from him. She is alternately bemused and wary, indifferent and desperately in need of connection with someone, if for no other reason than to keep the ghoulish figure away. This figure haunts her steps, hunts her. He appears anywhere, at any moment, with a cold grin on his face, like he knows something she does not. Somehow, he is connected with that hulking ruin outside of town. She visits Saltaire over and over again, unsure of what she is looking for. The ghoul drives her out, and the ruin pulls her in. The town itself is a ruin to her. Multiple times, it is as if she slips into some kind of parallel world. The town falls silent around her. She cannot hear anyone, and nobody can see or hear her. She is powerless to communicate with anyone, completely alienated and alone. Then these thoughts of her alienation and of the ghoulish figure intrude upon her mind, and the music she plays on the church organ becomes something dark, foreboding, moody, and profane, leading to her losing her job, and in some sense, losing her soul in the process. The music is as much a character in Carnival of Souls as the people and the ruined pavilion are. Gene Moore provides an otherworldly score performed only on a trilling Wurlitzer, itself feeling like a product of a bygone age of silent films, dance halls, and dusty churches with gray-haired parishioners. It is never not creepy and unsettling, even when it's supposed to be happy. When it is meant to reflect your chaotic and disturbed mind, it is a tour de force of horror. Ahead of its time by a few years, Carnival of Souls is oppressively bleak. Its themes of alienation have no reprieve. Subtextually, critics have seen everything in it, from PTSD, mental illness, atypical neurology, alternative sexuality, and the critique of capitalism and modernity. Whatever it might represent, the conclusion is inevitability. For Mary, her dreamlike, nightmarish drifting through society, unable to touch and unable to be touched, physically or emotionally, leads her inevitably back to the desolate pavilion on the plain of the Great Salt Lake, and a ballroom full of dancing ghouls, each one having risen from the brine, caked with salt, an apparent victim of drowning, leering with rictus grins as they chase her out to the water. In the end, there is only a single set of tracks leading out to the salt flat, the imprint of her collapsed body, and nothing else. Something has spirited her away, and not to any heaven or healing. As they gaze on the spot where Mary collapsed, her body missing, a single shot frames both the doctor and the pastor, the man of science and the man of God, neither of whom had an answer for her, and both of whom have encountered something beyond their ken. Everything is desolate and disoriented. Sadly, Carnival of Souls was a commercial failure on its release. Its disconsolate atmosphere disorienting it from audiences, and its slow burning psychology doing little for the drive in schlock movie crowd. However, thankfully, a legal quirk saved it from oblivion. Nowhere in the film is the requisite copyright information, casting Carnival of Souls into the public domain immediately upon its release. That made it easy fodder for television and eventually home video, where it would be reproduced en masse for a much more appreciative audience in the years to come, who could understand it as a movie ahead of its time and afford it deserved status not only as a cult classic, but one of the great horror films of all time.